Chapter 18. The First AMORAIM. After the disappearance of the earlier authorities of the tradition and the passing of the generation that had completed the Mishnah and the leadership of Gamaliel III, a new historical phase began for the Jewish world. This period unfolded with unusual contrast. Externally, it was marked by relative stability due to the favorable stance of a Roman ruler. Internally, it was shaped by a renewed intellectual energy led by a new class of scholars who expanded, interpreted, and organized the inherited legal and moral traditions. At the center of this transition stood Judah II, the patriarch, son of Gamaliel III, representing the hereditary leadership of the Jewish people known as the Patriarchate, an institution recognized by Roman authorities as the political and religious headship of the Jewish community in the land of Israel. Alongside him in Judea were leading teachers such as Jochanan, regarded as the foremost legal authority of his generation, and Simon ben Lachish, known for his strength of mind and rigorous analytical reasoning. In Babylonia, the intellectual centers outside Roman control, figures such as Abba Erika and Samuel led parallel scholarly developments, forming a dual axis of Jewish learning between the land of Israel and the Babylonian diaspora. The early life of Judah II took place in an environment where strict religious observance dominated daily life, extending even into public behavior. The authority of religious law was so deeply embedded that even members of the patriarchal family were publicly corrected when they appeared to deviate from communal expectations. On one occasion, Judah and his brother Hillel walked on the Sabbath in the town of Beiri wearing footwear with ornamental golden buckles. In that locality, such adornment was considered inappropriate for the sacred day, and the local population openly criticized them. Lacking the authority to justify their conduct in that setting, they removed their footwear and submitted to public pressure. On another occasion, the patriarch's sons were bathing together in the town of Kabul when local inhabitants objected, declaring that such conduct between brothers was not permitted in their community. These incidents illustrate the intense social enforcement of religious norms in this period, where communal expectation could override even the status of leading families. When Judah II assumed the office of patriarch around the year 225 of the Common Era, he enacted a significant administrative change by relocating the seat of the Patriarchate and the Central Academy from Sepphoris to Tiberias. Tiberias, which had previously been regarded with suspicion due to concerns over ritual purity connected with ancient burial sites, was transformed under his leadership into the primary intellectual center of Jewish life. From this point onward, Tiberias became the final stronghold of classical Jewish tradition in the land of Israel after other centers declined. One of the formal religious functions under patriarchal authority, the declaration of the new lunar month, which determined the religious calendar, was also centralized in Tiberias under Judah's leadership. This shift symbolized the broader transfer of religious authority away from earlier southern regions of Judea toward Galilee, marking a geographic and institutional transformation in the structure of Jewish leadership. Judah II, like his grandfather before him, was widely recognized by his contemporaries with titles of respect, such as rabbi or our teacher, reflecting his status as both political leader and principal interpreter of religious law. Although he was frequently subject to criticism, he responded with greater restraint and acceptance than earlier generations of patriarchs. During his leadership, a unique political situation developed through the rise of the Roman Emperor Alexander Severus, who ruled from 222 to 235 of the Common Era. He came to power at a very young age through the influence of the Roman Praetorian Guard, the imperial military body responsible for selecting and protecting emperors. Alexander Severus adopted an unusually favorable attitude toward Jewish tradition compared to most Roman rulers. In his private quarters, alongside symbolic representations associated with Greco-Roman and emerging Christian traditions, he also displayed an image associated with Abraham, the foundational patriarch of Judaism. He promoted a moral principle widely associated with Jewish ethical teaching, expressed as the idea that one should not do to others what one would not wish done to oneself. This principle was used in imperial communication and governance as a general ethical guideline for public conduct and military discipline. Under his rule, Jewish and Christian communities were sometimes presented as moral examples in contrast to broader Roman society. This emperor also attempted to structure appointments to public office in ways that reflected merit-based principles similar, in concept, to religious ordination practices within Jewish and Christian leadership systems. Despite this favorable stance, he faced criticism from certain populations in major cities such as Antioch and Alexandria, where satirical commentary referred to him using terms associated with Jewish religious leadership, reflecting both political mockery and cultural tension. His mother, Mamaea, was noted for her interest in Christian teaching and maintained contact with Origen, an influential Christian scholar and theologian of the early church. During this period of relative imperial favor, the Patriarch Judah II was able to exercise a level of authority that approached independent judicial power over aspects of the Jewish community, although still under Roman oversight. His position allowed him to manage internal community governance, including the appointment of religious judges and scholars, and to maintain recognized privileges for Jewish communal life. Historical traditions describe meetings and interactions between the Patriarch and the Emperor during Roman military campaigns in the eastern provinces, particularly during operations connected with conflicts involving the Parthian successor states. In these accounts, the emperor is described as confirming certain Jewish communal rights, including limited re-entry into Jerusalem and the reactivation of judicial functions that had previously been restricted under earlier Roman policies. Traditional Jewish narrative sources also attribute symbolic acts of favor to this emperor, including donations to synagogues and grants of land in regions, such as Gaulonitis, intended to support scholarly institutions and students. These accounts reflect a period in which the patriarchal office operated with enhanced recognition, combining religious authority with a degree of political influence under Roman imperial protection. In the same historical period in which the Roman world was influenced by rulers of Syrian origin, particularly Emperor Severus Antoninus, also known as Caracalla in Roman records, there existed a tradition that this emperor showed openness toward foreign religious systems and practices. Within this atmosphere of imperial curiosity toward different faiths, a narrative developed in Jewish tradition describing a request made by the emperor to the Jewish patriarch, Judah II, who was the highest religious and legal authority of the Jewish people at that time. According to this account, the emperor asked the patriarch to recommend a learned individual who could assist in constructing an altar modeled after the structure used in the ancient Jewish temple in Jerusalem, the central sanctuary of Jewish worship before its destruction by the Roman Empire. He also sought guidance in preparing incense according to the precise regulations of Jewish religious law. In this narrative, Patriarch Judah is said to have recommended a trusted associate named Romanus, a figure presented as a close companion within scholarly and communal circles. During the approximately 13-year period in which Severus Antoninus ruled over the Roman Empire, the Jewish population experienced a comparatively stable and favorable condition. This was significant because earlier generations had endured persecution and political hostility. The improved situation led some contemporaries to interpret historical prophecy in relation to this period, particularly a passage from the book of Daniel in the Hebrew Scriptures, which speaks of limited relief granted to a weakened people during times of imperial succession. Some interpreted this as a reference to the reign of Severus Antoninus, seeing his policies as unexpectedly favorable toward the Jewish community. This relative easing of tensions contributed to a gradual softening in the long-standing hostility between Jews and Romans, a hostility that had developed over centuries of conflict, including revolts and their aftermath. At the same time, Christian communities observed these developments with concern and criticism. Christian writers of the period expressed the view that Jewish communities appeared more willing to interact with Roman and pagan society than with Christians themselves, despite sharing certain religious foundations. This perception highlighted growing divisions among religious groups within the Roman world. As political and social barriers between Jews and Romans weakened, several restrictions that had previously enforced strict separation began to lose their force. Members of the patriarchal household, due to their association with high-ranking Roman officials, were permitted to adopt certain Roman customs, including hairstyles and cultural education, such as the study of the Greek language. Practices that had once been prohibited as forms of cultural assimilation were now increasingly tolerated. Jewish daily life in some regions became more socially open, with greater acceptance of artistic decoration in private spaces, and a reduced level of religious concern regarding visual representations that had earlier been viewed with caution. This change reflected a broader shift in attitude during a period of political stability. It is likely that this more relaxed environment also influenced Patriarch Judah II in his efforts to modify certain long-standing religious restrictions. During earlier periods of conflict, particularly during the first major revolt against Roman rule, a rabbinic assembly had enacted prohibitions limiting economic and social interaction with non-Jewish populations, including restrictions on purchasing or using oil produced by them. These regulations were intended to reduce cultural and religious integration with surrounding societies. In the land of Judea, which had previously produced sufficient agricultural resources, such restrictions were manageable. However, following the devastation caused by the war led by Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century of the Common Era, agricultural production declined significantly. The destruction of olive cultivation in particular created practical difficulties, making strict adherence to the old prohibition increasingly burdensome. Although many communities had already begun to disregard the restriction out of necessity, formal legal authorization for its removal had not yet been granted. Patriarch Judah II therefore sought to obtain broader rabbinic approval for lifting the ban on the use of oil produced by non-Jews. This effort involved significant debate and resistance among religious authorities, indicating that the reform was controversial. When Simlai, a scholar who frequently traveled between the regions of Galilee and the land of Judea and Babylon in the eastern Jewish communities, reported that permission had been granted to Jews living near the Euphrates River to use such oil, the leading Babylonian authority Abba, Erika, initially found the report difficult to accept. Only later did another prominent scholar, Samuel, support the acceptance of the ruling in order to ensure recognition of the patriarch's authority even in distant Jewish communities. In addition to this reform, Patriarch Judah II proposed further changes to existing religious practices. One such proposal concerned the legal process of levirate marriage, a biblical law requiring a man to marry the widow of his deceased brother under certain conditions. He suggested that in specific cases this obligation could be avoided through a formal divorce document prepared in advance of death. This proposal was not accepted by the broader rabbinic assembly. He also considered permitting the consumption of bread prepared by non-Jews, another long-standing restriction intended to limit social integration with surrounding populations. However, the same scholarly authorities agreed with one reform that reduced mourning customs during marriage ceremonies. A practice introduced during earlier periods of persecution, which required brides to be carried in restrained and modest conditions, was abolished, allowing for more formal ceremonial honor during weddings. Despite the great respect afforded to Patriarch Judah II, the teachers and interpreters of the law did not refrain from criticizing him when they considered it necessary. His position carried authority similar in influence to royal power within the Jewish community, including the ability to enforce decisions through appointed representatives. Yet some scholars opposed the concentration of such authority in a single office. One of the most outspoken critics was Simeon, the son of Lachish, a scholar known for his strict commitment to legal precision and independent judgment. He objected to what he perceived as efforts to reduce distinctions between scholars and the general population in matters of civic responsibility. In one recorded instance, during a public lecture, he argued that even the patriarch himself should be subject to judicial punishment, such as corporal discipline if found guilty of wrongdoing, just as any other individual would be held accountable under the law. At a moment of internal dispute within the leadership of the Jewish community under Roman rule, a disagreement arose concerning the extent of authority held by the patriarch, the hereditary leader of the Jewish people in the land of Judea during the Roman imperial period. Shagai, one of the voices within the scholarly circle of the Rabbinic Academy, raised a critical concern. He argued that if the patriarch were ever to be formally removed from office due to misconduct or abuse of authority, he should not be allowed to return to power afterward. The reasoning behind this position was rooted in fear of political retaliation, that a restored leader might use his authority to punish those who had opposed or judged him. This discussion was widely understood as an implicit challenge to the growing concentration of power in the office of the patriarch, at that time held by Judah the patriarch, a descendant of the line of Hillel the elder. The patriarch reacted with immediate anger. Acting on impulse, he ordered his servants, described in the sources as Gothic slaves, meaning foreign-born attendants of non-Jewish origin employed in elite households of the Roman period, to arrest the individual who had raised the objection. However, Jochanan, the head of the Rabbinic Academy, intervened and succeeded in calming the situation, preventing the escalation of internal conflict. On another occasion, Judah, the patriarch, expressed frustration regarding the conduct of Roman administrative authorities. This period followed the death of the Roman Emperor Alexander Severus in the year 235 of the Common Era, after which the Roman Empire entered a prolonged phase of instability. During this time, multiple claimants to imperial power emerged across different provinces, including legitimate emperors, rival claimants known as anti-emperors, and military usurpers. Each exercised authority over parts of the empire and imposed heavy fiscal demands on subject populations. In this unstable environment, Judah addressed Ben Lachish, a prominent scholar of the period, requesting prayers for relief from Roman oppression. He stated that Roman rule was burdensome and unjust. Ben Lachish responded with a sharp remark implying that if Judah himself refrained from taking excessive advantage of his own position, he would not suffer from external exploitation. This response was understood as a moral critique of Judah's own financial administration and concerns regarding wealth collection. During this period, the patriarchal institution increasingly relied on systematic financial contributions from Jewish communities across the Roman Empire. This development was driven by economic necessity. The land of Judea had experienced severe impoverishment due to repeated taxation, war damage, and loss of agricultural property. Large portions of farmland had been transferred into the possession of non-Jewish landowners, forcing many Jewish proprietors to sell their ancestral holdings. As a result, the traditional funding of religious education and rabbinic academies became insufficient. The patriarch Judah therefore organized a structured system of external revenue collection. Emissaries were sent to Jewish communities abroad to gather financial support for the maintenance of religious institutions, particularly the academy located in Tiberias, a major center of rabbinic learning in the region of Galilee. One of these emissaries, Joshua son of Levi from the city of Lydda, traveled to Rome itself, where a wealthy Jewish population was believed to reside. These communities contributed voluntarily to the support of the central institutions of Jewish learning, which had replaced the former Sanhedrin, the ancient Supreme Judicial Council of Judea. This institution was seen as the remaining symbolic authority of Jewish national and religious continuity, and its leader was regarded as connected, in traditional belief, to the ancient royal house of King David. According to tradition, Jewish merchants and maritime traders contributed a fixed proportion, described as 1/10 of their profits, to support students of the Tiberian Academy. These contributions were known by several administrative names, including the patriarchal tax, the apostolic contribution, and the crown levy, reflecting both religious and civic dimensions of the obligation. Despite criticism regarding financial administration, Judah the patriarch maintained strong public respect due to his personal conduct. He was known for simplicity in dress and behavior, often wearing plain linen garments and avoiding elaborate ceremonial display. This modesty contrasted with expectations that a leader of his rank should maintain visible signs of authority and prestige. His informal conduct during public audiences further reinforced his reputation for accessibility, although some contemporaries viewed it as inconsistent with the dignity of office. Upon his death, extraordinary honors were performed in recognition of his status. Although Jewish law normally restricted priestly participation in contact with the dead to maintain ritual purity, a member of the priestly lineage, a descendant of Aaron, was permitted to take responsibility for his burial. This exception was justified on the grounds of the unique national significance of the patriarch. Following his death, leadership continuity passed to members of his family. Hillel II, his brother, is described as a figure of moral reflection and scriptural interpretation. He is attributed with ethical teachings emphasizing communal responsibility, humility before death, and avoidance of judgment over others without understanding their circumstances. During this period, interaction between Jewish intellectual leaders and early Christian scholars also increased. Origen, a major theologian and philosopher of the early Christian church based in Alexandria, Egypt, visited members of the Jewish scholarly community in order to study Hebrew language and biblical interpretation. He referred to the patriarch under the name Julos in his writings. Origen sought assistance in understanding difficult passages of Hebrew scripture, particularly in relation to the Psalms. This intellectual exchange reflected a broader scholarly movement in the Alexandrian Christian school, led by figures such as Pantaenus and Clement of Alexandria, who attempted to reconcile Hebrew scriptures with emerging Christian theological systems. This required knowledge of the original Hebrew language, as Greek translations often produced interpretative differences. Origen regarded Jewish scholars as authoritative sources in matters of Hebrew language and scriptural interpretation. During his extended periods of residence in the region of Judea, between approximately the years 229 and 253 of the Common Era, he consulted Jewish teachers for clarification of biblical texts and traditional interpretations. At this stage in intellectual history, the study of legal tradition, known as halakha, had not yet completely replaced the earlier emphasis on direct biblical exegesis. Scriptural interpretation remained an active field of study alongside the developing legal systems, marking a transitional phase in the evolution of Rabbinic Judaism and its engagement with surrounding intellectual traditions. Alongside the teachers Hillel and Simlai, there existed other Jewish scholars deeply trained in the original Hebrew text of the sacred writings. These scholars engaged in direct confrontation with Christian teachers of the time, challenging their interpretations and criticizing what they regarded as weak and unfounded arguments derived from a corrupted Greek translation known as the Septuagint, the ancient Greek version of Hebrew scriptures widely used in the early Christian world. These Jewish scholars mocked what they saw as the acceptance by Christian interpreters of implausible reasoning drawn from that translation. They were especially critical of the way Christian communities treated apocryphal writings, texts not part of the Hebrew canon, yet which were being received as though they were ancient and authoritative. Works such as the narratives attributed to Tobit, Judith, and Susanna were being included in Christian scriptural collections, forming what Jewish critics considered a fragile and unreliable foundation for theological claims. In response to these criticisms, and in an effort to defend Christian interpretation of Scripture, the Christian scholar Origen undertook a major scholarly project aimed at revising the Septuagint translation, which by that time had accumulated numerous inconsistencies, errors, and textual variations. His purpose was not only textual correction, but also apologetic, to provide Christian teachers with a clearer understanding of the differences between the Greek translation and the original Hebrew text, so that they could better defend their positions in debates with Jewish scholars. To achieve this, Origen compiled and compared multiple Greek translations of the Hebrew scriptures. These included the versions of Aquilas, Samachos, Theodotion, and 3 additional translations that had appeared in the same general period. He organized these texts into parallel columns for systematic comparison. At the top of this structure, he placed the Hebrew text itself, accompanied by a phonetic transcription written in Greek letters to aid readers unfamiliar with Hebrew script. This monumental comparative edition became known as the Hexapla, meaning the six-fold arrangement. However, despite the enormous scholarly effort involved, this work did not resolve the underlying issues. The flawed Greek translation remained widely used in its imperfect form. In fact, the complexity introduced by Origen's comparisons sometimes increased confusion, as passages from different versions were inadvertently mixed in later transmission, further complicating the textual tradition. While these debates over scripture and translation continued in the wider intellectual world, the Jewish scholarly centers in Palestine focused their energies on a different task. Their primary concern was not the Bible itself, nor abstract theological doctrine, but rather the detailed study and interpretation of the oral legal tradition known as the Mishnah. This legal code, already compiled in a concise and condensed style, contained many expressions and legal formulations that had fallen out of common usage, making its interpretation increasingly difficult and requiring specialized training. The leading scholars of these academies devoted themselves to explaining and clarifying the often compressed and obscure language of the Mishnah. Because of this interpretive role, they became known as AMORAIM, meaning interpreters or expounders. Initially, their task was limited to explaining existing material, relying on inherited traditions without introducing independent legal rulings. However, over time, this role began to change. Although they formally considered themselves bound by the Mishnah, they gradually expanded its interpretive boundaries. In practice, they went beyond mere explanation and began developing new legal reasoning, effectively extending the original framework while still presenting their conclusions as consistent with it. In this way, the Mishnah was not only explained, but also transformed through continuous analysis, much as earlier scholars had previously done with the biblical text itself. The first generation of these AMORAIM, who followed immediately after the final Tannaite and semi-Tannaite authorities, formed a historical parallel to earlier scholarly transitions. Like the preceding generation of teachers, they included highly skilled scholars who lived to advanced ages and whose intellectual activity extended across many decades. They also developed distinct academic schools and differing approaches to interpretation, though their disagreements were generally less confrontational than those of earlier periods. Unlike earlier eras marked by intense doctrinal disputes, this generation operated within an accepted framework of shared authority, which provided a common reference point for all legal discussion. Even when opinions differed, they did so within a recognized system that preserved overall unity. Among the earliest and most respected of the AMORAIM was Chanina, son of Chama, from the city of Sepphoris, who lived approximately between the years 180 and 260 of the Common Era. He came from an ancient and respected family lineage and practiced medicine, a profession often associated with members of the priestly or scholarly classes. His method of teaching was notably restrained and traditional. He restricted himself to explaining the Mishnah and earlier legal traditions using only interpretations already received through established transmission, avoiding independent reasoning or innovative legal deduction. When faced with legal questions not directly addressed in the Mishnah, he did not issue rulings on his own authority. Instead, he consulted with fellow scholars or even with students, regardless of how straightforward the issue might appear. This cautious and conservative approach placed him in a position similar to earlier authoritative figures who preserved tradition without altering it. However, this method did not satisfy the younger generation of scholars, who sought greater intellectual engagement and interpretive development. As a result, even some of Chanina's own students eventually left his direct guidance and established new centers of study with more expansive methods of interpretation. Despite this, Chanina continued to be held in high esteem by both Jewish communities and Roman officials because of his personal piety and reputation. On one occasion, when he and a younger contemporary, Joshua son of Levi, visited a Roman provincial governor in the city of Caesarea, the governor stood in respect upon their arrival. When others expressed surprise at this gesture toward Jewish scholars, the governor explained that he perceived them as resembling angels. Chanina was also known for his outspoken criticism of moral and social weaknesses within his community. He did not hesitate to address what he considered harmful patterns of belief particularly the tendency to rely on miraculous expectations in place of personal responsibility. He challenged the widespread belief that divine intervention would relieve individuals of accountability for their actions. His remarks concerning the population of Sepphoris, the city in which he lived, provide a vivid reflection of social conditions in that period. On one occasion, when a severe epidemic spread through Sepphoris and surrounding regions, many inhabitants of different districts were affected. However, the quarter in which Chanina resided remained unaffected, a circumstance that contributed further to his reputation among his contemporaries. In the city of Sepphoris, a center of Jewish life in Galilee, tensions arose during a time of plague and social distress. Certain inhabitants sought to hold the religious leader Chanina responsible for the outbreak, arguing that he had failed to prevent it through prayer or miracle. Chanina responded by drawing a comparison to the era of Moses, the ancient leader of Israel. He stated that during the time of Moses, when only one man named Zimri had committed a grave moral transgression involving a foreign woman, a plague had still resulted in the deaths of 24,000 people. He then pointed out that in his own generation, such wrongdoing was far more widespread, implying that moral decline, not lack of prayer, was the cause of suffering. On another occasion, the region of Judea experienced a prolonged drought with no rainfall. Chanina had organized fasting rituals and public prayers, which were traditional religious responses meant to seek divine intervention. However, no rain followed these efforts. The community became dissatisfied and pointed to Joshua ben Levi, a respected figure who had previously been sent as an envoy to Rome and was believed to have successfully prayed for rain in the southern region of Judea. In response to public pressure, Chanina summoned Joshua ben Levi from the southern region and joined him in prayer. Yet again, no rain fell. At this point, Chanina addressed the people directly, challenging their interpretation of religious power. He declared that neither Joshua ben Levi nor himself controlled the rain. Instead, he argued that moral behavior determined divine response. He stated that the inhabitants of Lydda, a city known for humility and kindness, received rainfall because of their character, while the people of other regions, described as hardened and indifferent, did not. Chanina maintained a consistent attitude of humility throughout his life. He openly acknowledged the merits of others and, in his later years, took satisfaction in seeing younger scholars surpass his own achievements. He lived to an advanced age and witnessed the leadership of 3 successive patriarchs: the elder Judah, who had been his teacher, Gamaliel, the son of Judah, and Judah II, under whom he continued to serve as a respected authority. In contrast to Chanina's conservative and morally focused approach stood Jochanan bar Napachah, a leading scholar born in the year 199 of the Common Era and who died in the year 279. He lost both parents at an early age and later reflected that this personal tragedy had, in a paradoxical way, freed him from the strict obligations of filial duty as defined by religious law. Jochanan was noted for his exceptional physical appearance. Traditional scholarly texts, which usually avoid poetic language, describe his beauty in highly symbolic terms. They compare him to a newly polished silver vessel filled with red gemstones and surrounded by red roses placed between light and shadow, suggesting an almost radiant and idealized form of human appearance. Despite this, his physical traits lacked a full beard, which in that cultural context was often associated with masculine dignity, and his long eyebrows partially shaded his eyes. In his youth, Jochanan studied under the elder Judah, but later admitted that he had not fully grasped the depth of the legal discussions at that stage due to his age and inexperience. Because of limited financial resources, he initially entered into commerce alongside a fellow student named Ilpha. During this period, a warning tradition attributed to his teachers suggested that he was destined for great scholarly achievement, leading him to abandon trade and return fully to religious study. In order to support himself, he sold his remaining land and devoted himself entirely to learning, without concern for financial security in old age. At a later stage, he was supported by the patriarch Judah II. Jokinen became deeply involved in multiple scholarly environments, studying under various teachers to gain a broad understanding of legal tradition. He eventually became the principal assistant to the Patriarch Judah II and emerged as the most influential Amora, meaning interpreter and transmitter of legal tradition of his generation. His teachings formed a major portion of the Talmudic tradition, as his students preserved and transmitted a large body of his interpretations. His method of study involved detailed analysis of the Mishnah, the foundational compilation of Jewish oral law, examining each statement carefully and comparing it with other teachings. Through this analytical approach, he sometimes concluded that not every statement in the Mishnah carried equal legal authority. He also developed guidelines for resolving disputes between earlier scholars known as Tannaites, especially when their opinions differed. Under his influence, the city of Tiberias became a major intellectual center, attracting students from across the region due to its favorable climate, agricultural fertility, and therapeutic waters. His academy drew scholars from Babylonia, even though independent centers of learning already existed there. More than 100 scholars accepted his rulings as authoritative and incorporated them into their own teachings. Jokinen maintained close relations with the Patriarch and supported efforts to adjust certain long-standing customs. He adopted a relatively flexible approach compared to more rigid Babylonian traditions. For example, he permitted the study of the Greek language for men, arguing that it provided protection in legal and administrative contexts, and for women, considering it culturally enriching. He expressed respect for Greek civilization alongside Jewish tradition, suggesting that both could exist with value. He illustrated this idea through a symbolic interpretation of the biblical figures Shem and Japhet, representing Jewish and Greek cultural spheres respectively. He also supported innovations such as allowing decorative artwork in interior spaces, a departure from earlier restrictions. Despite these relatively open cultural positions, he remained critical of Roman rule, viewing it as marked by arrogance and coercion. In interpreting the biblical visions of the prophet Daniel, he associated the fourth symbolic beast with the Roman Empire, an image that became widely used in both Jewish and early Christian interpretative traditions. The interpretation of the ancient prophetic vision attributed to the Hebrew prophet Daniel, a figure from the sacred writings of the Jewish tradition, describes a sequence of empires symbolized as beasts. In this explanation, the fourth beast represents the Roman Empire, understood as a dominant political power that had destroyed all preceding kingdoms in its rise to supremacy. Within this symbolic vision, a small horn emerging from the fourth beast is identified with Rome itself in its most oppressive form. This horn is described as having eyes resembling human eyes, which are interpreted as a sign of calculated attention and jealousy. These eyes are explained as Rome's constant scrutiny of wealth and prosperity wherever it appears. According to this interpretation, whenever an individual becomes wealthy, Roman authorities quickly elevate that person into administrative positions connected with public provisioning, such as oversight of food supply systems, or assign them seats in municipal governing councils. These positions, though seemingly honorable, are presented as instruments through which the state ensures that private wealth becomes responsible for public obligations, effectively placing financial burden and risk upon the wealthy individual. In this context, one of the leading sages, Jokinen ben Nappaha, offers a striking warning reflecting the same distrust of Roman administrative systems. He advises that if a person is ever offered a position within a governing senate, meaning a formal council responsible for civic administration under Roman authority, it would be safer to choose exile in a remote desert region along the Jordan River Valley rather than accept such an appointment. He even permits, under exceptional circumstances, the act of leaving the land of Judea entirely to avoid the crushing obligations imposed by municipal service, which were often compulsory and burdensome. Despite these harsh realities, Jokinen ben Nappaha is portrayed as a man of deep moral discipline. His household conduct reflects a strict sense of equality, as even the servant who attended him was allowed to share in the same food prepared for his master, showing an unusual ethical stance towards social hierarchy in domestic life. However, his personal life is marked by profound tragedy. He suffers the loss of 10 sons, one after another. In response to this repeated grief, he carries with him a small bone that remains from his last deceased son. This object becomes a symbol used when speaking to others who experience similar bereavements, as he would point to it and remind them that he too had endured the loss of all his children. Ultimately, only one daughter remains, and his life concludes with him nearly childless, having been deprived of nearly all direct descendants. In extreme old age, Jochanaan ben Nappaha is described as experiencing episodes of mental distress, which are attributed to overwhelming sorrow. A central cause of this grief is his close companion and brother-in-law, Simeon ben Lachish, also known by the shortened name Resh Lachish. Jochanaan comes to believe that he himself played a role in circumstances leading to Simeon's death, a belief that deepens his emotional suffering. Simeon ben Lachish stands as one of the most striking figures among the scholarly leaders of the time. He is both close companion and intellectual rival to Jochanaan ben Nappaha, and at the same time his brother-in-law through family connection. His personality combines physical strength with intellectual sharpness and emotional depth, making him a figure of strong contrasts. He is believed, despite this background, Simeon ben Lachish later becomes deeply involved in the study of the Jewish law, known as the Torah, and develops a reputation for strict honesty and intellectual rigor. His personal integrity is so widely respected that people considered trustworthy are often associated with him as a sign of credibility. His demeanor is serious and restrained, and he avoids unnecessary laughter, reflecting his belief that excessive joy is inappropriate during a time when the Jewish population lives under foreign domination. He is known for his uncompromising commitment to truth, even when it leads him to openly criticize authority figures, including the patriarchal leadership. In legal reasoning, particularly in the analysis of religious law, he is described as using highly complex methods of argumentation, capable of constructing intricate chains of reasoning for and against legal interpretations. In interpretive traditions related to narrative and ethical teachings, he often presents unconventional conclusions that challenge established assumptions. For example, in discussions about the figure of Job, a biblical character known for suffering, Simeon ben Lachish concludes that Job was not a historical individual, but rather a literary and moral construction designed to convey ethical lessons. This interpretation is unusual for his time and is met with confusion by many of his contemporaries. He also expresses the view that certain angelic names found within Jewish tradition did not originate within the Hebrew cultural system, but were instead adopted from foreign, particularly Persian, sources and later integrated into Jewish thought. In philosophical reflection, he challenges the belief that earlier generations were inherently superior. In contrast to those who claim that ancient figures were spiritually elevated compared to later generations, he argues that the current generation holds its own merit, particularly because it continues to study the law despite political oppression and hardship. Although deeply connected to Jochanaan ben Nappaha through friendship and family ties, Simeon ben Lachish eventually becomes intellectually and emotionally separated from him during their later years, reflecting increasing disagreement and tension between the two scholars. Alongside these two figures stand Joshua ben Levi, another prominent scholar of the same generation, forming a triad of leading authorities within the scholarly tradition of the land of Judea. He is the son of Levi ben Sisai and leads a school in the city of Lydda, located in the southern region of Judea. Although the people of Lydda are often viewed by Galilean scholars as overly proud and lacking depth, Joshua ben Levi maintains a strong reputation that transcends regional prejudice. His legal interpretations of religious law are frequently accepted as authoritative, even when they differ from the opinions of both Jochanaan ben Nappaha and Simeon ben Lachish. Joshua ben Levi himself acknowledges that during periods of administrative activity involving the organization of communities in southern Judea, he lost access to certain traditional teachings, leading to gaps in his knowledge. This reflects the instability of the region following earlier revolts and political disruptions under Roman rule, during which leading scholars such as Jochanan ben Nappaha and Jonathan traveled through these areas to restore communal structure and legal order. Joshua ben Levi, a prominent teacher connected with the Jewish patriarchal court, was also at one time sent to the city of Rome in the role of an official collector of revenues on behalf of the patriarch, the hereditary leader of the Jewish community in the land of Israel, who maintained authority over religious and communal matters under Roman rule. While in the capital of the Roman Empire, Joshua ben Levi encountered a scene that, in his understanding, exposed a deep contrast within imperial society. He observed a statue carefully covered in drapery, an arrangement intended to protect it from environmental wear, while nearby there sat a beggar, lacking even minimal covering for basic dignity. This contrast became emblematic in later traditions of the social imbalance present within the Roman world. In another tradition associated with his visit, Joshua ben Levi was said to have expected the arrival of the Messianic Redeemer in the very heart of imperial power. According to this idea, the Messiah would be present in Rome in a concealed form, appearing as a servant among the poor, beggars, and infirm at the city gates, waiting for the moment of divine command to initiate the redemption of the people of Israel. In legendary material surrounding his figure, Joshua ben Levi was also portrayed as belonging to a select group of righteous individuals granted extraordinary spiritual access to the prophet Elijah, a prophetic figure from the Hebrew tradition who was believed not to have died, but to continue appearing in moments of divine intervention. In these traditions, Joshua ben Levi was described in symbolic terms as one who overcame the boundary of death itself, being granted passage in a heavenly realms while still alive, where he was said to have traversed conceptual domains such as heaven, paradise, and the realm associated with judgment and punishment. In this narrative framework, he was even imagined as transmitting symbolic reports of these realms through angelic intermediaries back to the patriarchal authority in the land of Israel. In a different intellectual development of this period, a scholar named Simlai introduced a new method of interpreting the narratives and ethical teachings embedded within the traditional scriptural material known as the Aggadah, the non-legal narrative portion of rabbinic literature. Simlai originated in the city of Lydda, a center of Jewish learning in the coastal region of the land of Israel, but later relocated to Nehardea, an important early center of Jewish scholarship in Babylonia, where the emerging movement of Babylonian AMORAIM, meaning interpreters of the traditional law, was beginning to develop. Simlai maintained close relations with Judah II, the patriarchal leader who succeeded in the lineage of Judah I. Although Simlai was not regarded as a leading authority in legal discussions within the Palestinian academies, his contribution lay in a different intellectual direction. He compiled a systematic enumeration of the commandments contained in the Torah tradition, identifying 613 commandments in total, divided into 365 prohibitions corresponding symbolically to the days of the solar year, and 248 positive obligations corresponding in traditional interpretation to the structure of the human body. Simlai further traced a process of ethical condensation in the biblical tradition. He taught that King David, the ancient monarch of Israel, reduced the extensive legal system into 11 fundamental ethical principles, including honesty, justice, truthfulness, rejection of slander, rejection of malicious intent toward others, avoidance of harm to neighbors, contempt for moral corruption, respect for those deemed righteous, sanctity of oaths, willingness to lend without interest, and refusal to accept bribery. According to this interpretive tradition, the prophet Isaiah further condensed these principles into 6 core ethical demands, including moral integrity, truthful speech, rejection of self-enrichment through injustice, refusal of corruption, resistance to malicious influence, and control over harmful desire. The prophet Micah was then described as reducing the ethical system to 3 central values, namely the practice of justice, love of charitable action, and humility. Later, a second prophetic figure, referred to as Second Isaiah, further reduced the moral framework to 2 guiding principles, justice and charity. Finally, The prophet Habakkuk was said to have summarized the entire system into a single foundational statement, emphasizing that the righteous person lives through faith. This intellectual progression represented an early attempt to express the entire legal and ethical system of the Torah tradition in increasingly abstract moral principles. Simlai also transmitted a symbolic narrative in which different nations were assigned distinct roles within the broader historical development of the world, reflecting his broader philosophical and interpretive outlook. Because of his familiarity with scriptural language and interpretive methods, Simlai also engaged in discussions with leading figures of early Christian theological thought, known as the Fathers of the Church, who were actively engaged in interpreting the Hebrew Scriptures in support of emerging Christian doctrines. During this period, Christianity had undergone significant transformation. Early Jewish Christian groups, such as the Ebionites and Nazarenes, had given way to a more unified institutional structure known as the Catholic Church, meaning universal church, which incorporated a wide range of theological influences, including teachings associated with Paul of Tarsus, opposing interpretations, and elements drawn from surrounding Greco-Roman religious culture. As smaller sects were either absorbed into or excluded from this developing structure, authority increasingly concentrated in the hands of bishops, particularly those of the city of Rome, the capital of the empire. These Roman bishops gradually asserted supremacy over other regional church leaders, intervening in doctrinal disputes and establishing centralized authority, eventually developing into the institution later known as the papacy. With the consolidation of this ecclesiastical structure, Christian scholars intensified efforts to systematize doctrine and reinterpret earlier traditions. One major development concerned the formulation of the doctrine of the Trinity, in which the unity of God was expressed in terms of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the latter understood as a distinct divine presence parallel to God and the Messiah figure. This doctrinal development diverged significantly from the strict monotheism of Judaism, yet Christian theologians sought to support it by reinterpreting passages from the Hebrew Scriptures. This required complex allegorical interpretation techniques, in which biblical texts were read as containing hidden or symbolic references to emerging Christian theological concepts. Whenever the sacred Hebrew Scriptures contained multiple expressions or names for God, certain Christian interpreters claimed to see within the very wording of the text an indication of what later Christian doctrine would call the Trinity, meaning the concept of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as one divine reality. They even turned to the opening words of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew law, which state, "In the beginning God created heaven and earth." Within this interpretive approach, those Christian teachers argued that this phrase itself secretly pointed to the participation of Christ in creation. They interpreted the word beginning not merely as a starting point in time, but as a reference to wisdom or the word expressed in Greek as logos, which they identified with Christ. From this reasoning, they concluded that the sentence concealed the idea that God created the world through Christ, and therefore that the doctrine of Christ's divine role in creation was already embedded in the Hebrew text. However, as long as the leading Christian thinkers were not familiar with the Hebrew language and its original sources, they were not able to conduct serious structured theological debate with Jewish scholars on equal terms. It was only later, when prominent Christian intellectuals such as Origen, a major theological writer and scholar who worked extensively in Palestine, began studying Hebrew sources more carefully, that detailed and systematic polemical discussions between Jews and Christians became more frequent. Within this intellectual confrontation, Simlai, a Jewish teacher and interpreter of Scripture, became especially notable for defending the doctrine of the absolute unity of God against the emerging Christian doctrine of the Trinity. He presented his arguments with careful reasoning, drawing directly from scriptural interpretation. In response to Christian readings of the same texts, he demonstrated that the passages of the Holy Scriptures which were claimed to suggest plurality within God in fact, when properly understood, strongly emphasize the indivisible unity of God, leaving no room for misunderstanding when interpreted through his method. His intellectual opponent in these theological debates, is described as likely being Origen, who at that time resided for a long period in Palestine and was deeply engaged in scriptural study and theological writing. Thus, the Jewish scholar Simlai and the Christian scholar Origen represent two opposing interpretive traditions engaging in structured religious argument, each using scriptural analysis to defend its theological position. In this period, Jews and Christians, who had once lived in closer proximity like members of a divided household, now no longer shared common communal life, but instead interacted primarily through structured theological controversy. What had once been internal tension had now transformed into formal intellectual debate between two distinct religious systems. At the same time, opposition to Christianity within broader non-Christian intellectual circles also increased, and this had the effect of making Jewish writings more widely known among non-Jewish thinkers. These thinkers, in turn, sometimes used Jewish texts in their efforts to argue against the expansion of Christianity. Within Christian interpretation of the Book of Daniel, a text from the Hebrew prophetic tradition, Christian theologians believe they had discovered symbolic and numerical predictions that they associated with Christian beliefs and with the anticipated final judgment at the end of time. They treated the text as if it contained hidden prophetic references to the appearance of Christ. In response to these interpretations, the philosopher Porphyry, a Neoplatonist thinker influenced by Greek philosophical traditions, composed a critical commentary on the Book of Daniel. He is considered unique among ancient writers for producing a systematic analysis of a biblical book from a non-Christian philosophical standpoint. Porphyry, who also bore the Semitic name Malchus and originated from Batanea, a region that had formerly been part of a Jewish-influenced territory, argued against the Christian interpretation. He maintained that the Book of Daniel was not a prophetic document written in ancient times foretelling future events, but rather a historical work composed during the period of persecution of the Jews under the Syrian monarch Antiochus Epiphanes. According to his analysis, the symbolic and ambiguous expressions within the text were not predictions of Christianity, but references to events of that historical era. Therefore, he rejected the Christian claim that the book contained oracular prophecies about Christ or the Christian future.